Thank you, Blair, and thanks to everybody for coming. I'm going to try and get some little bit peas out of my pop there. And thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center and to the Cold War International History Project and everybody that's working on and interested in these issues. It's really a pleasure to be here. I want to tell you first a little bit about how this whole project got started. It was 1998. The ruble had just crashed. Russia was a sullen, dark, very, very unhappy place that autumn. Banks were closed. People were waiting in lines, lost their savings, not paid for months. And a young man who was working for the United States Department of Energy was on a mission to go to all the facilities that had highly enriched uranium and plutonium, fissile material, and check to make sure that the video cameras and the portal monitors and all the fancy equipment that the United States had installed in the 1990s was working. And at the Institute of Theoretical and Experimental Physics, located on a very pleasant 89-acre estate in Moscow, he went in and all the cameras were working and the videos were on, all the protection was there. At this institute, there were dozens and dozens of 6-inch long canisters clad in aluminum of highly enriched uranium, which they had used for their experiments. But as he looked around, he realized that there was one very unanticipated problem. All the guards who manned the video cameras and watched over the uranium had not been paid and walked off the job. The canisters were sitting there, nobody looking but video cameras at them. This young fellow gathered all the employees at the institute that he could find, 32 people, into the deputy director's office on a freezing cold day. So cold, he said he had never quite experienced anything like that, even in Moscow. He took out of his wallet all the cash the Department of Energy had given him for this one trip, his per diem, and put it on the table and said, "Will you get the guards to stay here for 2 months until I can get back? $50 a month." This was 1998, not just after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the fissile material, the uranium, was sitting in those canisters without a single guard on a cold Moscow afternoon. A few weeks after that, I visited Obninsk, the Institute of Physics and Power Engineering south of Moscow, another famous Russian nuclear research institute. There are 10 tons of fissile material there. A lot of it are in very small discs, about 2¼ inches across. In fact, there are 100,000 of those discs in buckets at Obninsk, and there's just one problem. They're not numbered. They're not inventoried. You could put a dozen in your pocket and walk out with them. And they were struggling when I was there that day to begin the process of keeping track of those discs. In the year 2000, the doors swung open for me at the Institute of Applied Microbiology in Obolensk, also south of Moscow. This laboratory was the scene of some of the most diabolical and bizarre research in genetic engineering carried out in the secret Soviet biological weapons program, which I'll talk about briefly today. What really amazed me, aside from the ability as a journalist to walk around Corpus Adin, the big, tall, central building where these experiments had been done, it was the first time Western journalists had been invited, was that Nikolai Urakov, the director, told us the Institute, which had huge amounts of cultures of these dangerous pathogens, was at that time receiving 1% of the budget it had received in Soviet times and was desperate, looking for other work. That was the year 2000. So these experiences led me to ask, what else was going on in Russia in those years? I was the Moscow bureau chief for the Washington Post. I was able to explore, to roam, to ask questions. And I also asked myself, how did it get this way? This began a long research effort to roll back the clock to the 1980s a period I had covered in Washington as a White House correspondent for the Washington Post, and to understand how the fissile material, the pathogens, the chemicals got so widely spread. And in the process of that research, I got very lucky one day. I discovered the papers from the Kremlin of Vitaly Leonidovich Katayev. Mr. Katayev was a professional staff member in the Central Committee. He passed away in 2001. But as I was doing my research, I found that he had left behind a large amount of documents from the time that he served on the Central Committee as a staff member. He was in the Defense Department, which was responsible for the entire military-industrial complex. And Mr. Katayev was one of those fellows who lived by the power of his pencil and his pen. He filled dozens of large notebooks with notes every day of technical details, things that had happened in the Kremlin, arms control, weapons decisions. And what's so fascinating about this archive, which will be available publicly to everybody at the Hoover Institution, is that you get an inside view of some of the most important turning points and decisions of Soviet arms control, weapons development in the last years of the Cold War. And I think this is really important because a lot of us in struggling to understand this period, certainly we have read and listened to the American history, the declassified history, looked at the documents, asked ourselves questions about what our leaders were thinking. But it was always very difficult to understand what Soviet leaders were thinking and saying to themselves. Certainly they produced a large amount of material that we could absorb that was intended for us in their speeches and in their articles. But here is a chance to understand what they were saying to each other privately. So today I'd like to share with you two short case studies of things I discovered in this research that we didn't know before, and they both focus on Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. As we're coming to the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, I thought it would be timely to focus on Gorbachev and how we learn some very important things about his role in this period. His role is central to my story and in my book, but I also felt that I discovered things that in all the previous years we didn't know, and definitely got a new understanding of what that role was. I think it's important to remember that Gorbachev's achievements in ending the Cold War, breaking what he called the speeding locomotive of the arms race, allowing the revolution in Europe to unfold peacefully, ending the confrontation in the Third World, these were not his first objectives. They grew out of his own desire for radical change at home, rooted in his own experience as a peasant son, a young witness to World War II, a university student during the thaw, a party official in the years of stagnation. And most importantly, they grew out of his own deep impressions about what had gone wrong. Gorbachev did not set out to change the world, but rather to save his country. And in the end, he didn't save the country, but he may have saved the world. And one part of this was Gorbachev's deep and profound understanding of the burden of the military and the hyper-militarization on Soviet life. He saw this, he accumulated this over many years. He didn't talk a lot about it publicly, of course he couldn't. But when he became General Secretary, he was quickly presented with a test. So my first point is, what happened in that year of 1985? What was presented to Gorbachev in that very early period when he came to office, when Reagan had proposed his Strategic Defense Initiative? A lot of people have ascribed to Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative some kind of legendary power to have caused change in the Soviet Union. And I'm here today to address that with new evidence, and I hope to cause us to rethink a little bit Gorbachev and his role in this context. Now, you know